We're only a week or so away from the next federal budget, and joining us to maybe speculate a little bit on some of the happenings in and around that is our Professor of Politics from the University of Newcastle, Dr. Jim Jost. Jim,
Yes, good morning, Mark.
Time for the Commonwealth chequebook and the purse to be opened up and see what is inside.
Well, Mark, it will be interesting to see what the Morrison government comes up with at the moment, because as we know, they're not looking too good in the polls. Everything seems to be going in the wrong direction for them. And while polls aren't necessarily the most reliable indicator, it would appear that, at least if we look at it sort of in a big picture sense, the government is not particularly very popular. And for the first time, I think in the life of the government, the opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, is level with the Prime Minister on the preferred Prime Minister stakes.
Which is really the one that counts at the end of the day.
And I mean, I find those preferred Prime Minister polls, if you like, lopsided, because, you know, you've got an incumbent who everybody is more or less familiar with, and then you've got a lesser known person who's got no record as a Prime Minister, so it's a false equivalence, really. But coming back to the budget, the political strategy is what is going to be interesting here as to what the Morrison government decides to do, because just abstracting from the actual politics and the cutting and thrusting and so forth, and looking at budgets set the parameters for not just government spending, but for the development of policy, the future unfolding, if you like, of the way in which the government can influence the economy. And so getting those settings reasonably right, as it were, is really important. And you would think that this particular budget is one of the most important ones that we've probably had in a long, long time. And that's because it's a budget that's coming in a sense, the third one in a row, 3 years of serious disaster issues, bushfires, the pandemic, which we're still sort of coming out of and still grappling with, and now on the East Coast, particularly in the northern part of Australia, we've got all the floods and the devastating floods, and they're going to take ages to sort out. So the budget will need, in a sense, if you're doing a responsible budget for setting the long-term recovery in Australia and keeping the economy, as focused as possible, you would expect that the budget itself would set parameters that are going to be in the long-term interest, Mark, not simply in the short-term electability interest of the government.
Which does bring us to an interesting point. Yes, all of those heavy issues are where the heavy lifting is going to need to take place, and certainly we would expect to hear a lot more about plans to transition out of those problems on budget day. Of course, then there's always the bits and pieces that trickle out beforehand, and I don't know, and this maybe others have got a different view on this. I think the things that are trickling out, maybe reading the room wrong with all this other stuff that's happening. We've leaked out that there most likely will be, a cut in beer excise, 30 cents a glass. Really? Is that the most important thing that we can be dropping this early?
Well, there are ways, I guess, cutting excise, particularly the fuel excise, for example.
Which is still maybe not, we don't know yet.
They appear to be, shall we say, good sugar hits for the government. They can say they're easing the cost of living, etc. But in the longer term, that doesn't necessarily serve the economy in the best way. And I think it's a 50-50 cost-benefit analysis with the fuel excise. The biggest losers are largely people on fixed incomes, people at the lower end of the income scale. Now, there are ways in which the government can offset that cost of living issue by perhaps using tax offsets for low-income earners, extending the current tax offsets for them, and so forth. There are also other strategies the government might pursue, and whatever it chooses. In fact, I guess if I was to sort of make a small prediction, Mark, the government will be looking to buy themselves back into power.
Totally. But that's what a budget's for.
Well,
shouldn't be, but the reality tells us otherwise.
Well, certainly a budget before an election.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the coalition has a pretty consistent track record. 98, 2001, 2004. They tried again to do the same thing in 2007, but the sort of the Rudd juggernaut overrode them, and then Labor sort of was doing a little bit of that, handing out benefits just before the election type thing to try and keep people on side.
Well, there was a massive lot of that though with the GFC hit. I mean, most of us got the.
But that's not buying an election. That's managing a huge hit to the economy and to keep everything afloat.
But everyone would say that whatever measures they're doing would be doing the same thing, rightly or wrongly. Everyone would say that.
I think up to a point, Mark. And also you've got to remember that the coalition were totally opposed and hostile to what the then Labor government did in 2007 and 8 to manage, get Australia through the GFC successfully.
Oh, and some of it great stuff and some of it absolute rubbish too.
Well, as with everything, I think you find that, policy on the run
exactly
doesn't end up being good policy. And we saw a couple of real disasters when Labor were in power, and we've seen similar disasters through the pandemic as the government has tried to negotiate it. And it's sort of done, again, policy on the run, in part because it's had to. These things were sort of really pressing. And so one has to be, take a reasonable view here that, people were sort of working within parameters that they had no idea of how it was going to pan out, how they were going to manage it effectively. Overall, one would say that the state governments did a pretty good job. The Commonwealth government, I think that's sort of 50-50 as to whether it did a good job or not. It certainly took a lot of credit for things that the state governments were doing. And I think, unfortunately for the Morrison government, the handling of the floods has just reinforced the negative perceptions that came out of the bushfires, that came out of some of the handling of things that were unfolding with the pandemic, like vaccine rollouts and border control and all of that. So there's a lot of negatives that the government has to deal with. And in part, they will be hoping that their budget announcements and their budget projections will ease some of that and help people forget come polling day, which we expect to be sometime in May. So the government's also facing a bit of a windfall, despite the rise in fuel costs and all that. The commodity prices are going sort of through the roof. So there's something like about an $18 billion windfall for the government that it wasn't necessarily budgeting for. So it's got a little bit of a cushion.
A little bit to claw a little bit back.
And so it's not going to be as bad a picture as it was. And I don't think most economists understand that and political scientists and so forth understand, Mark, that the issue of a budget deficit is not the most pressing at the moment. The issue is getting the parameters right for a longer term recovery, and that means judicious spending on the part of the government to keep the economy ticking over in the right way.
Well, we'll see if they can frame the conversation around that, Jim, and obviously a lot more stuff you would imagine would come out before the budget time very, very soon. Jim, as always, thank you for your time. We'll see you next time.
My pleasure, Mark.
2NURFM, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.